Hello, my name is Katsuhiko Hara. Thank you for the introduction. As explained, I am the chief desk editor for Nikkei Asia in New York now. I lead the team with other editors reporting about just about everything in Asia, mostly business and finance. But I have also been an editor in Tokyo for Nikkei Asia, communicating with the reporters, commissioning stories, and put them on the website, of course. And I can say one thing is that this semiconductor is the sector that we constantly had big news all the time, even more so since the coronavirus hit the world and because it aggravated the supply chain so much. And I think today is like a really good time and good day to have this webinar because only 2 days ago, the major semiconductor companies, TSMC, had a ceremony in their new plant in Arizona where President Joe Biden showed up and said, America is back in manufacturing. And I thought it was very significant that President said that because America is back in manufacturing what America needs at the moment, a very crucial moment. And for those who have been following the topic would probably know that U.S. Congress passed the law, so-called the CHIPS Act, to promote more production of semiconductors in the United States and also promote research of microprocessors so America stays on top of this high-tech competition. Now, coming from Japan, I can say Japan is moving in pretty much the same direction, trying to promote the industry, And then, of course, China has been trying to catch up in this sector for years, even before this chip crunch happened. So I think it is really, it was the symbolic moment on Tuesday, the ceremony was. But of course, right now, at the moment, biggest suppliers, largest suppliers of semiconductors in country or economy region, we can say is South Korea and Taiwan. And that makes the situation also tangled with geopolitics. It's no longer just trade and industry matter. And I think that's the main topic today. So let me move on to introducing our panel speakers. Hopefully they can briefly introduce themselves and talk about their background, how they're connected with semiconductors. So can we start with Jimmy, please?
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. Always happy to join our friends with the Asia Society, and I'm a subscriber to the Nikkei Asia Times. So, and of course the FT, two different publications that are involved here today. So really exciting to be part of this. I'm Jimmy Goodrich, the Vice President for Global Policy at the Semiconductor Industry, based in Washington, D.C. I lead all of our international work as it relates to supply chains, international trade, and China. In a previous life, I lived and worked in China for about 7 years, and up until COVID, had been a frequent traveler visitor, and have been kind of watching and engaged in China's semiconductor industry development for almost a decade. That's a little bit on the introduction, but happy to dive more into the discussion when we get into it.
Thank you. Okay, Lauly, please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauly Li. I'm a tech correspondent of Nikkei Asia. I've been covering the tech supply chain for years, such as Apple, Google, and Huawei supply chains. And in recent years, we've been monitoring closely on how the geopolitics reshape the tech industries, all the way from semiconductor manufacturing to final product assembly, like iPhone assembly. I look forward to exchanging thoughts with my fellow distinguished panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauly. Let me remind everybody who's joining this webinar that we are supposed to have one more speaker, Orville Schell, but I guess he's running a little late right now. Hopefully he can join us very soon. Okay, so let's just start the discussion. So let me start off with situation in Taiwan. And my question is this, how does the current geopolitical environment surrounding Taiwan affect the supply chain or the future of the supply chain? And, how serious do we really need to worry about it? be on our toes and think that something could really happen? And why should we care so much about it, right? Jimmy, would you like to start off on this topic?
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about the importance of Taiwan in the global semiconductor ecosystem, and then I'd love to hear Lauly's thoughts about the current situation, the political dynamics. Taiwan has really created an amazing ecosystem where over the last several decades, it's pioneered a whole new business model called the fabless foundry business model. That was Morris Chang, who was in Arizona this week for the kickoff of the TSMC factory in Arizona. It was really his foresight and entrepreneurial spirit that said, wait a minute, chip companies don't have to just produce for themselves. They can produce for customers, external companies. And he set up this foundry, now Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, with assistance from the Taiwanese government early on, and created this new business model that allowed the design community, the communities of chip companies that are just designing, to not worry about building and operating factories, spending all sorts of billions of dollars in precision equipment, but allow them to outsource that for manufacturing. And so Taiwan has really had a phenomenal story. It's now grown to be one of the world's largest hubs for chip production. Around 20-25% of all chip capacity is located in Taiwan. And it's not just trailing edge or mature chips, but the most advanced chips. So today, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, is really the undisputed leader in semiconductor manufacturing process technology, with well over 70% of all the advanced technology nodes in Taiwan. TSMC, though, is not the only story in town. There's many other really innovative players in Taiwan. Taiwan accounts for about half of the world's advanced semiconductor packaging. There's the front-end manufacture that happens in facilities, and then when you take that chip, you have to chop it up, package it, and test it. And Taiwanese companies really specialize that, particularly in outsourced semiconductor assembly test. But also chip design, companies like MediaTek, equipment materials. There's a lot of other memory, for example. U.S. companies like Micron have big operations on the island for chip manufacturing. So Taiwan is a really vibrant ecosystem. It's really carved out its own niche in the global economy, where, frankly, the world economy is now underpinned by a lot of these semiconductor innovation and supply chains that run through Taiwan. In fact, I think it might have even been in the FT. There was a story about how a study found that Taiwan contributes well over $2.2 trillion in economic value because of the semiconductor technologies that it enables. So it really is a critical hub to the semiconductor ecosystem. And of course, that's why, from a geopolitical perspective, it's become an even more important topic. The private sector, obviously, we fully understand that no one company or country can really master all chip production within their own borders. China can't, Taiwan can't, the US can't. And now we've got the CHIPS Act. Taiwan's looking at incentives. China has incentives. And at the end of the day, it's really going to be a balance of how much interdependence we are all willing to live with, because that interdependence is never going away. It's too complicated for one company or country to be able to do all of this on their own. So that's kind of a backdrop from what Taiwan does today and why it matters from an industrial perspective.
I see. Thank you. Okay, I see that Orville just joined us, but let me ask a related question to Lauly first, and then we'll have Orville introduce himself. So Lauly, let me ask you, does the situation make TSMC and other suppliers feel uncomfortable, or is it good business that everybody wants, Taiwanese companies to make clients all over, in Japan, United States, elsewhere? What is your view on this?
Well, to talk about Taiwan, I'd like to start with why chips matter. As we know that these tiny little chips are the hearts and brains to enable electronic devices, and it is everywhere today in every connected product. So semiconductors have become a matter of national security issue, especially when the world suffered the unprecedented chips and component shortage in late 2020 during the pandemic, which severely disrupted the supply chains and hit a swath of industries from smartphones, PCs, game consoles to automobiles, etc. So I think it was until then, this chip shortage crisis, people really realized the importance of supply chain continuity and wanted to improve the resilience of the supply chain. So that comes to Taiwan's global positions. Like Jimmy said, nowadays, people are getting worried about the mounting US-China geopolitical uncertainties, as well as the tensions surrounding the Taiwan Strait will have an adverse impact on the semiconductor supply chain. Why? Because Taiwan accounts for more than 60% of the global semiconductor market, excluding memory chips. And in terms of advanced chip making, the island accounts for more than 90% of global market share. So in other words, if anything bad happens to Taiwan, a serious disruption of the chip supply chain is very much expected. And I think that is one of the reasons, I think, why we should really care about this topic.
Okay, thank you. So do you think TSMC is happy to invest so much in the United States or in Japan? Or?
I think it has to.
Too far?
I think it has to.
Okay.
I think inevitably it has to. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay. Since Orville joined, Orville, would you like to make a brief introduction of yourself and let the audience know how you're related to this topic today?
Sure. I'm sorry, I'm in a Amtrak waiting lounge, so it's not optimal circumstances. Well, I'm Orville Schell, and I direct the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. And we have a project with Stanford's Hoover Institution, which is looking at the role of Taiwan, China, and the U.S. in the whole semiconductor supply chain nexus, and trying to factor into the equation political risk, which is, of course, evident everywhere, and is I think, the very thing we're talking about today. What's the likelihood that this infinitely complex supply chain system, which has Taiwan, China, and the United States, and the rest of the world all sleeping in the same bed, what's the likelihood that that's going to be disrupted? And if it is disrupted, what happens?
All right, thank you. So let me move on to the next topic, or the question, I should say. It's just been raised that, producing semiconductors is like a national security matter for most of the industrial countries, I guess, Japan, US, China, and South Korea, Taiwan, and many others. So now it has become, we are now in a situation where geopolitics is mixed into this, and also the geoeconomics is into this. They're like also intertwined. So decision-making is always influenced by one and another. So what does that mean for, the future of the US or the European countries to interact with Asia, in relation with Asia? Maybe Orville, we want to take this question first.
Well, that's precisely the challenge, isn't it? That a world that we once thought was basically on the same page. It didn't matter where we sourced things, as long as we could get them cheaply, quickly, and didn't have to maintain large inventories. And that meant that Taiwan even went and worked closely with China. We went and worked closely with China. Everybody became dependent on each other. And now we find ourselves in a world where Putin's invading the Ukraine, and where the threat of invasion or something happening in the Taiwan Straits is real. And we find ourselves dependent in a way that is, of course, going to be severely disrupted if there's any sorts of military conflict in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, or the Taiwan Straits. So that's the challenge. And I find that everybody says that decoupling is really unthinkable. We're too closely entwined. And as somebody who's not a businessman, not a tech person, but a China specialist, I simply point out the trend line is not good when it comes to the prospects of a Pacific. And so this is a question that we have to wrestle with.
Interesting. We had the mention of decoupling here. Lauly, would you like to comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, what we are seeing today is a drastic change for the semiconductor manufacturing sector, because for the past several decades, the chip-making industry has been pretty much centralized in Asia, particularly in Taiwan, South Korea, and China. But in light of the disruption by the pandemic, as well as the mounting geopolitical uncertainties, we are seeing a diversification of the chip-making industry, trying to spread out the chip-making segment from Asia to the West. So apart from the US, we are also seeing Europe, Japan, India, approving their own versions of the CHIPS Act to strengthen their own chip industry in order to lower the dependency on particular countries in Asia. And I want to further mention that, like Jimmy mentioned, TSMC just held its equipment tooling ceremony at its Arizona facility, which is the Taiwanese chip maker's first advanced fab in the US for the past 20 years. My colleague Annie went to Arizona and did some great on-ground reporting there for Nikkei Asia. What I want to say is that at the event, it is announced that TSMC is going to triple its investment in Arizona to $40 billion, and it has plans to bring the more advanced 3-nanometer chip production technology there, which I think it really is a big victory for the US to bolster its chip supply chain ecosystem domestically and lower its dependence on Asia.
I see. Jimmy, would you like to comment on this part?
Yeah, so, the industry, of course, was kind of birthed out of the United States with the invention of the integrated circuit. And throughout the first decades of its history, it was really housed within US shores. But very quickly, actually, at the end of the 60s, into the 70s and 80s, the industry globalized because in order to achieve scale necessary to finance innovation, the industry needed access to global markets and needed to be able to find the best talent and resources to do specialized parts of the supply chain. So now we live in this really globalized world where Europe, for example, specializes in lithography, advanced research, and analog chips. Korea is the dominant powerhouse in memory chip manufacturing. Japan, dominant in a lot of the equipment and specialty gases and materials. Taiwan in the contract logic manufacturing, and mainland China and Southeast Asia, very strong in semiconductor assembly, test, and packaging. Just kind of looking in and zooming into one example, we all have heard about ASML, the company that manufactures the most advanced precision chip-making equipment known as extreme ultraviolet lithography. Their own supply chain to build that one tool while they're located in the United States is incredibly global. They have over 10,000 different parts and components that are integrated into that machine across a long global supply chain with cutting-edge research done in Japan, Germany, the Netherlands, the United States. So even for that one single piece of equipment, it is dependent on an extremely and highly integrated global supply chain. So the challenge really is around moving forward. What does it mean when the US and China are locked in this strategic competition? I think what we're moving towards is a more bifurcated supply chain, although not preferred, but a bifurcated supply chain around the leading edge technology. And you can see that with the October 7 export control rules that the Biden administration promulgated. A lot of the restrictions that the Trump and Biden administration have implemented on China have really been focused around selective decoupling at the leading edge of technology. And on the other hand, of course, China, with its Made in China 2025 policy, indigenous innovation that predated a lot of these policies in the Biden and Trump administration, is also focused on trying to localize a lot of the technology within its own borders. So you have sort of Washington and Beijing both trying to eliminate dependence on each other. And that obviously for a very globally integrated industry brings, as Orville said, major challenges, and the outlook in some cases, particularly for those that are deeply integrated into the China supply chain, is very challenging.
Okay, thank you. Well, Jimmy, if I may, I would like to ask a very quick follow-up question. So was it inevitable for companies like Intel to focus on designing and not manufacturing? Is it like something that had to happen in the course of history that now it needs to go back and have its own plant now?
Well, obviously there are still many American companies that have their own manufacturing. Intel is still an integrated device manufacturer. They have multiple fabs in the United States. They're the largest semiconductor employer in the United States. They have Arizona, Oregon, New Mexico. They will have Ohio. So they've got multiple chip plants. Micron Technology, Texas Instruments, Analog Devices, Microchip, you name it. Actually, the U.S. has chip manufacturing in 18 states. The challenge, however, is that the U.S. output of chip production has been pretty stable. But our share of the worldwide chip production has shrunk dramatically as the rest of the world, particularly East Asia, has grown exponentially. So in 1990, the U.S. accounted for about 37% of front-end chip production. And today that's down to around 11 or 12%. And again, that's sort of the rest of the world just grew really fast as the U.S. was flatlining. And the goal of the CHIPS Act is to try and reinvigorate manufacturing here. Companies like Intel are making major announcements, TSMC this week, Samsung. And so the U.S. policy actually is quite open-minded, recognizing that we shouldn't put walls around innovation, and the U.S. should have the best companies possible bringing that technology into the United States. It also creates more competition in the market. So there's a lot of excitement around this. And, you know, on the other hand, there are many U.S. companies I mentioned that are fabless. They don't have any fabs whatsoever. The sort of, hallmark company would be like Qualcomm or AMD. That's not to say they're not involved in the manufacturing. They send engineers out to the fabs. They are highly integrated with the manufacturing process, but all those assets are sitting with a company like TSMC or Samsung. And they really specialize in that. And, I don't think they're going to be getting into manufacturing anytime soon, but the fact that TSMC, Samsung, Intel are building onshore capacity in the U.S. is good for them because it gives them an onshore option. There are now actually customers in the U.S., major electronics companies that are selling products into banks, the Defense Department, telecommunication systems that are saying, we want to have an onshore U.S. option. Tim Cook, I think, standing there in Arizona welcoming the fab in Phoenix is the best example, saying for the first time in about a decade, they'll be producing some of their own chips back here in the United States. So it requires not just the chip makers to work on this, but also their customers. And we're seeing that in a very positive development.
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, that's a very insightful thing. Okay, and you also mentioned a little bit about our next topic, which is Biden administration's export control toward China. And so what, maybe I can ask Orville this first, but how does the Biden administration view the connection between the chip making and the national security? So it's not just promoting chip production in the United States, but it seems like the administration is trying to avoid China from getting ahead in this tech competition. How does what's like the approach for the Biden administration on this?
I think there are two aspects to Biden's policy. One is to make sure that our supply chains are not disrupted in a way that might harm, foremost, of course, national defense, national security interests, and other kinds of manufacturing as well. But I think the second thing is to try to assure that America keeps a technological lead so that we aren't dependent upon China in case something happens. And here, of course, the tragedy is that we had 9 presidential administrations that did ardently support the notion of engagement with China. But that has come sadly to an end. And that is what is precipitating all of these other kind of conjectures about, all right, how do we decouple? Where should we decouple? When should we decouple? And of course, this is a painful and long-term process if it's going to be done without massive disruption. And that, of course, is the challenge that both we and every other country in the world is confronting, including China, because we're each dependent on the other in critical ways that cannot be solved quickly. So I think Biden is making every effort to keep American ascendant as a technological leader in this field. and to onshore more of the fabbing process to actually make the chips, not just design them and have the IP for them. But still, even with TSMC putting $40 billion in Arizona, it's a very small contribution to something that is now become globalized.
Jimmy, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so China is, whether we like it or not, a major hub in the global electronics supply chain. And that's really where today China is important. If you think about laptops, PCs, cell phones, electric vehicles, China is assembling today the vast majority of those devices. And so as a result, China on an annual basis has been importing more integrated circuits or semiconductors than they do oil. If you think about that, that's really amazing. Half of those chips are coming in, they're getting integrated into those electronics, and then getting exported back out. But the other half are staying there and being consumed within China. And China on its own, even if you remove that export base, is still probably about 15, 20% of the global consumption of things with semiconductors in them. And so, for any semiconductor company to be competitive, whether you're in the upstream equipment, materials, and software space, whether you are designing or fabricating memory, logic, or analog chips, or you're in the assembly, test, and packaging business, there's a common factor, which is that virtually every company has a substantial amount of revenue coming from China. On average, for example, US semiconductor companies derive around 36% of their revenue from China. For some, it's much lower. For some, it's much higher, but it's still a significant market. And that revenue that US companies earn, multinational companies earn from the China market, they then take and then reinvest back into their workforce, research and development, and increasingly important capital expenditure to facilitate factory expansions. And if we don't have access to that market, either by China substituting our products or by the US or others forcing us out, then we just become less competitive. We have less revenue to reinvest. We call it the virtuous cycle. So obviously that's, an extreme scenario where if we totally decouple, we'd have to, shrink the size of our industry, which is not something that I don't think anyone is looking to do. But what it does reinforce is that we have to carefully assess what our strategy and policy is moving forward. Having a small yard and high fence around the most sensitive technology, that is a truly game changer for national security, for technological advantage, but ensuring that the majority of trade in semiconductors that relates to Bluetooth sensors, your tire pressure device, frankly, it's difficult to find a national security concern relating to those kind of commodity mass market semiconductors. 1.15 trillion semiconductors were produced in 2021. So the scale of this is just incredible, almost impossible to completely understand. And so it's really around the balance of strategic competition. Which technology do we protect? How do we protect it? And who do we protect it with? Because the United States doesn't have a monopoly on all semiconductor technologies. We have about half of the market for chip sales, around 40% of equipment, 80% of key software. But we have many other companies around the world that could compete. And if the US takes unilateral restrictions, for the most part, those are going to be putting US companies at a disadvantage. So working together with allies is essential to ensure that whatever narrow and effective national security policy the administration wants to set, if it's not done with allies, it's not going to be effective. And then, bigger topic, and I think we can get into this later, is for the United States to stay ahead. We shouldn't be thinking about how do we trip up our competitor all the time, but how do we train ourselves to be a better athlete, a better competitor, run faster. And that's really where the CHIPS Act comes into play, investments into research development, our workforce, because we could do all we want to try and, slow China advances, but ultimately they're a large, formidable country with smart people. They're going to be able to advance their industry with or without us. And so we have to think about how we enhance and run faster our sector.
I see. So we started this conversation, starting off with the chip crunch that kind of became apparent after the COVID crisis and everything. But when we talk about this high-tech competitions and security matters linked with it, that began even before the COVID days, right? Even with Trump imposing his measures. So, Lauly, do you think this decoupling is almost inevitable when it comes to security matters, because these technology can be used in many different ways?
But I think, like it or not, the decoupling in some of the segments are already happening. And actually, I want to add on some of the points about what Jimmy said about the export controls. Because I really think that we can look at this from several angles. And to the Chinese tech companies, the latest export controls are definitely a severe blow to the country's tech ambitions. The new restrictions are tailored to limit Chinese chip makers' ability to access American technologies, such as their ability to buy chip-making equipment, which American companies like Applied Materials, Lam Research, and KLA all play a vital role in helping chip makers building semiconductors. So this is the most direct and immediate impact of the Chinese tech industry. And also from the US tech suppliers' perspective, take the chip equipment makers, for example, like what Jimmy said, the Chinese market has been a strong growth driver for the semiconductor industry for years, in light of China's ambition to be self-reliant in chips, which includes to reach 70% of self-sufficiency by 2025. And the latest export controls is going to hurt a big chunk of American equipment makers' revenue. So but these American companies had to halt their services to their Chinese client following the latest export control rules, which is a real negative impact on them. And if I may continue a little bit, if we look at the non-US, non-China chip-related companies like other Asian or European suppliers, it's becoming more and more difficult for them to operate business in China. TSMC, which has a chip facility in Nanjing, has said that it is still too early for them to assess the actual impact for them for the longer term. And South Korea's SK Hynix said that it will consider selling its memory chip facilities in China in the worst-case scenario if the export controls make it too difficult to continue operating there. And I want to mention that last month, I went to Munich to attend Electronica, the trade show. At the CEO Roundtable event, where CEOs of STMicro, Infineon, NXP, and Wolfspeed all attended that event. And the European chip makers said that although the latest export controls has rather limited impact on them at the moment, they're still very worried about the geopolitical uncertainties going forward. And they hope to have more stability to continue their business in the Chinese market. So the geopolitical uncertainties and their forces of decoupling are really having an impact on the entire supply chain.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you for that, because that kind of takes us to our next topic, which is about how are global businesses coping with this? Are they coping well, or are they not coping well at all? Or do you know, like Lauly, do you know of any examples of companies working around this situation well?
Yeah, I think since the chips and component shortage in late 2020, and then the on and off lockdowns in China, as well as, US tightening export controls against Chinese companies, really sent waves of shocks to the tech industry in the past several years. So many tech executives we've talked to have really thought about it and started taking actions to change, for example, their sourcing strategies, such as to verify more suppliers or to look for new production locations in different countries. And they're becoming more serious about verifying the end use of their Chinese clients to avoid violating the US export restrictions. And also, for example, my colleague Annie at the TSMC event in Arizona, she briefly talked with AMD CEO Lisa Su. And Lisa stressed that the supply chain continuity is now one of the top priorities for companies like hers. And she said that having more geographically diversified capacity is very, very important now. And we can also look at things from the perspective of the chip industry sustainability. Because I remember Wolfspeed CEO Greg Lowe during the Electronica event in Munich last month. He said that given the semiconductor industry is estimated to double and become $1 trillion industry by 2030, the industry needs to build more capacity, that's for sure. And there's no single place in the world that could afford such explosive growing capacity in one place, considering the supplies for water, electricity, land, and skilled engineers and technicians. So it is reasonable to, spread out the manufacturing of semiconductor in order to meet the accelerating demand for chips for the longer term.
I see. Jimmy, what is your assessment of the industry's reaction to all this in the past 2 years?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the industry obviously, when, stepping back, thinking about the geopolitical challenges, as we've talked about, the industry several years ago was, thinking about how does it make the supply chains more efficient? How can it deliver more innovation to their consumers on a more profitable basis? And that's the, foundation for most globally integrated industries. Our industry is still trying to do that, and that is our goal. But layered on top of that are geopolitical concerns. And, frankly, the importance of the semiconductor industry was always known by our sector, but the government revelation around the criticality of the sector was really, underscored by the COVID-19 pandemic. When people all of a sudden couldn't access the technology they needed, it's kind of like oil. Prior to the 1970s oil crisis, it wasn't thought of as sort of strategic national resource that it is today now. And it's one of these things where you don't know how important it is until you don't have access to it. So I think that's really something that our industry is now trying to navigate. Corporate CEOs, boardrooms are now having to think about geopolitics just as much as they're thinking about business. And one of the most important things for the business community is continuity, stability, and predictability, particularly for semiconductor companies that are trying to make long-term plans, where and how they invest their capital, when and how and where they hire people, what kind of technology they develop for the future. If they don't have clear rules of the road, it's very difficult to do that. And so, our industry recognizes that with increased US-China competition, there's going to be more challenges. There will be more tensions, but hopefully we'll see more predictability around what the government goals and strategies are and how they seek to achieve them. For example, Secretary Raimondo gave a speech at MIT around competing with China in a technology strategy. It's very helpful to hear in a sort of very crystallized fashion what the government strategy is. The October 7 rules obviously were a reflection of that, but there wasn't a whole lot of industry consultation, and they came kind of in the middle of the night to some extent for a lot of companies across the supply chain. So we hope there's better dialogue and discussion so that companies can more adequately plan and ensure that they can be competitive in the long run. Because I don't think it's the hope or wish or goal of any government to try and harm this sector. But as the governments start deploying tools that are powerful, they need to work with industry to ensure that there's transparency around activities and the ability to see over the horizon around what's next. So that, again, if the governments are going to start, putting a fence around, hopefully a small yard, that we know in advance and we can help plan for it.
I see. Well, thank you. Okay, you kind of answered question to our next part too, but let me ask Orville about this prospect going ahead. What are the prospects for easing the tension in East Asia, China, Taiwan? When you talk about South Korea, I think we do need to worry about North Korea as well. And of course, how will the United States be involved in all this? But in terms of these tensions, which way will it go in terms of building more effective and resilient supply chains, and what needs to be done by industry and countries?
Well, I do think that we see an unraveling really of the whole global compact here. And in this sense, I think the microprocessor sector is a kind of a metaphor. You see this reluctance, which we had not paid any attention to be dependent, to be reliant on other countries. And we see a triple reluctance to be reliant on countries that have different kinds of political systems that aren't in accord with our own and with whom we could possibly be at conflict. So I think Jimmy mentioned the question of planning, and the chip industry globally is really dependent on planning because it's such an infinitely complicated industry with so many different reliances and dependencies. But it is precisely the kind of unpredictability of the geopolitical situation which throws that planning process into complete cocked hat. So this is where we are, and we simply don't know what's going to happen. And so it's very difficult to plan. And I think companies who were very loath to get into the whole question of political risk in the past suddenly find themselves rushing off to consultancies to try to figure out alternative scenarios. There are no good ones. But nonetheless, something might happen that would cause companies to have to go to plan B. So what is that plan B? I don't think we really know. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to run to my Amtrak train, but thank you so much. And I'm sorry to be in and out in such a untoward manner.
Okay, thank you, Orville. Thank you very much.
Yeah, cheers.
Okay, Lauly, what's your view on the prospects going ahead?
That's really a tough question. I'm not a politician, and I don't think any companies will have a perfect answer for this. But I think the tech industry, either in the semiconductor industry or like final product manufacturers, have all started to take actions to diversify their manufacturing footprints or to verify more suppliers in the past several years as an insurance. And I also think that many tech companies' mindset for inventory management have changed from just in time to just in case, because all the disruption during the pandemic. So now more companies are now willing to pile a little bit more of inventories in case of unexpected supply chain disruptions. And I think also government's call to bring more production onshore is another strategy to, safeguard themselves from any kind of unexpected supply chain shocks. But that being said, supply chain diversification was never an easy task. Take the chip making sector, for example. These chip makers and their hundreds of suppliers spent decades building a complete and cost-competitive supply chain in East Asia. And it is going to take time, years and years of time, and resources from the companies, as well as non-stop support from the governments to help construct a new regional supply chain, a resilient regional supply chain with proper ecosystem and infrastructure. So I think there's still a lot of hard work to do.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Jimmy, like I said, you kind of answered the question already, but if you would like to add anything to it, and then we can move on to the guest questions.
Yeah, I think the goal moving forward is, how do we sustain innovation? How do we sustain Moore's Law? How do we create the workforce that can power this innovation in this new geopolitical reality? I think there's an opportunity to make the global supply chain more resilient, rebalance, so that while we're always going to rely on our friends in Asia for chip production, that there'll be an option to have, whether it's Europe or North America, a lot of different options of diversity in the supply chain. So I think moving forward, we're going to see really exciting developments here, Europe, perhaps Mexico, India, along with all the exciting innovation and production that happens in Taiwan, Southeast Asia, China, other parts of the world.
Okay, thank you. So I think it is time for us to take the questions from the guests. If anyone has a question, please post them in the chat function. And I think we already got one here. I'm very sorry, I cannot tell who this came from, but let me just read it out. In past decades, the world's makers collaborated on a unified semiconductor technology roadmap. example ITRS, one of the best roadmaps in any industry. What is the current nature of international collaboration on such long-term planning programs? Oh, this is an interesting one.
I can maybe take that one.
Yes, please.
So, the semiconductor industry throughout its history has been focused on technology innovation. And up until the last 10, 15 years, a lot of that innovation was around a standard technology roadmap because the industry was all seeking to sustain Moore's law, doubling the amount of transistors, generally silicon transistors, around every 12 to 18 months. And throughout the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s, the industry had the IRDS, the International Roadmap for Technology in Semiconductors. Now, the industry's become a little bit more diversified. Back in the day when even TI and Micron and ST Micro were all competing with Intel and Samsung and TSMC around the same lithography logic-based roadmap, that made sense because the whole industry could shoot towards one goal and try and overcome it. And that would allow the suppliers, universities, researchers to all contribute around a focused set of technology roadmaps and milestones. Now, the pathway in the industry has been very divergent. You have leading edge logic, which is really only 3 companies in the world that are pursuing that, not the whole industry. You've got memory chip technology, which has gone in a very different diverse range with 3D scaling for NAND flash and different technology for DRAM. And then analog chip technology, which is very based on legacy process technology, but feature rich, using a lot of non-traditional materials, doing power electronics. Think your microcontroller that goes into your car or your battery management system in an electric vehicle. That's in the analog space. So the need for a single roadmap kind of diminished over the last several years as the industry became more diverse. So we now see a lot of different roadmaps out there. The industry is working, for example, really closely with IMEC in the Netherlands at developing a logic roadmap. The National Semiconductor Technology Center that's going to be set up here in the United States, I think, is going to undertake a similar role. They're working on a memory. So basically you have a lot of different smaller roadmaps now being put together. And there's a lot of continued international collaboration around that. So I guess, it kind of reached its limit of usefulness as the industry evolved. And now we have a lot more diversity in terms of technology road mapping that's been undertaken.
I see. Lauly, do you have something you would like to add on this collaboration?
Yeah. I just recall that I spoke to NXP's chief technology officer just last month, and he said that the semiconductor industry is really the most globalized supply chain he has ever witnessed. For example, you have the EDA suppliers like from the US and from Europe, and you have like chip making equipments from Europe, from Japan, and material makers from Europe and Japan again. And then you have chip makers, logic chip makers in East Asia, but you also have a very powerful analog and power semiconductor makers in Europe too. So all the way, it's really a globalized supply chain that each region has its roles to play in this long and complicated supply chain. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me move on to next question. This is about European Union. The EU seems to have taken its own actions to support domestic chip making and decrease its reliance on Asia. Is that true? And what does this mean for EU relations with China and Taiwan? I think I have seen reports about EU having its version of CHIPS Act, just like United States, I think, right? Jimmy or Lauly, you want to take this question?
Lauly, you want to take that? Then I'll go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, the EU has approved its own version of the European CHIPS Act to support the chip making sector. And actually, I spoke to many of the chip making segment suppliers about EU's ambition for semiconductors, and mostly they are very welcome to have this kind of CHIPS Act to support, because it's really a capital intensive industry that requires government support to strengthen their own chip supply chain in Europe, which Europe has an existing foundation for decades. But you need more resources to strengthen and then to pursue the advanced chip making technologies. But the EU also has its weakness existing for its foundations. For example, it has a really strict environmental regulations that might be a hurdles for like chemicals and material suppliers to make more investment to cater the growing chip makers' demand there. Because the more sophisticated the chip making is, the more customized and more sophisticated the chemicals and materials will require. So you can't only just focusing on the chip making sector, but you also have to think about to bolster the ecosystem to make the supply chain stronger. So it's not just about chip makers, but also need to think about its ecosystem too.
I see. Jimmy?
Yeah, in Europe, obviously, they have their competitive advantage as well, very strong, as Lauly mentioned, equipment materials, but also in analog semiconductors. If you think about Europe's industrial sector, they don't have a lot of the electronics companies like that are doing cell phones like Apple or laptops and PCs. But what they do have, obviously, is the automobile sector in Germany, France, Italy, aerospace, robotics, I think ABB in Europe. And so a lot of the semiconductor companies in Europe, like Infineon, ST Micro, NXP, excel really in that space, industrial, automotive. And so a lot of the innovation that Europe is also excelling at is in that area, and advanced semiconductor technology. And so we see, for example, the European Commission proposing the EU Chips Act, 3 billion euros. That's right now going through the process of being approved. But also they're open in, for example, trying to encourage Intel to build an advanced chip making plant in Magdeburg in Germany. Global Foundries partnering with ST Micro in France.
Yes.
I think all in sort of anticipation that they too will be able to receive some of the funding. And I think if we step back and look at this, this really isn't a competition between the US and the EU. The EU has about 8% of chip production. We have around 12%. If we think of the US and the EU together as one sort of trusted zone in the global supply chain, that can be up to 20%. And we'll be able to hold our own weight together in a more combined power when it comes to rebalancing supply chains. I think to really have a more resilient global semiconductor supply chain, we have to be thinking about the US and the EU joined at the hip.
I see. Interesting. Okay, so the next question is, it kind of relates to what Lauly just mentioned, and it's about materials needed in producing semiconductors. The question says, I read that Ukraine is key supplier to critical gases for the production of chips. How do they cope? So this is Ukraine specific, I guess.
So for example, the semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem is incredibly complex. You have specialty gases, chemicals, materials that are going into the manufacturing process that are consumed on a huge volume. It's everything from tungsten and cobalt used to etch and deposit some of the advanced materials onto the silicon wafer to build the transistor. The specialty gases that are used to create vacuum chambers in the equipment or power the lasers, which is the neon and xenon gases. And actually that's where Ukraine came into the semiconductor supply chain, because neon and xenon is a byproduct of steel manufacturing. They're captured during the steel manufacturing process. And of course, Russia and Eastern Europe have a lot of steel production. And so as a result of that, there was a fear that there'd be a big supply chain crunch, but actually it was a little bit overblown. The industry managed to navigate that with some strategic inventories, new different areas of sources. It's not a difficult thing to produce. It's just there's only a few mega steel refineries around the world, and the industry was able to shift things around. But what it shows is that countries in far-flung places that you wouldn't expect actually have a critical role in the semiconductor supply chain. I was talking to some Central Asian countries, folks in the Middle East, and there's a lot of interest and ability for these countries to play a role. Not maybe in front end, $30 billion chip fab production, but in some of the specialty gases. Rare earths is another area. Rare earths are not rare. They're actually found in the ground all around the world, or at the bottom of the ocean or other locations. It's the processing of rare earths that is only done by a select few number of countries, particularly China. And that's also an opportunity for a lot of countries around the world who want to make themselves strategically relevant in the global economy, rare earth processing is another area that for parts of the world might make a lot of sense.
I see. Thank you. Lauly, do you have something that you want to add? We have one more question and we're kind of running out of time, but
okay. Then maybe we can move on to the next
Okay,
question.
okay. We'll get to the last question because I think this question is a good one too. Last question says, what is India's role in this subject, and does growing tension in Asia pose an opportunity for India? One country we didn't have much chance to mention. One thing I can say from me is that just today on Nikkei, we had an interview piece with Tata's chairman saying that Tata Group is planning to start semiconductor production in India, right? Not anywhere else, but India. And story even says that India doesn't really have much of an industry yet, but this can make a difference. Lauly, would you like to comment on this?
I think other than Tata, Foxconn, the iPhone assembler, who has a strong chip ambition, it is also partnering with an Indian conglomerate, Vendata, to build chip facilities in the Southeast countries. And I think that, like we mentioned earlier, the semiconductor has become a matter of national security. And India also have its own versions of offering incentives, of luring chip makers to build chip facilities in the country. And we actually spoke to the Indian representative to Taiwan just a couple of months ago. And he talked about the country's ambition for semiconductors. And he also talked about that the country actually has the foundation for chemical supplies for chip making too. So I think there's a chance for the countries to develop its own resilient chip supply chain for the longer term, for sure.
Thank you. Jimmy, your thought on India?
Yeah, just really brief. I've actually been to India twice this year, and there's a lot of promise, but actually little known outside of the industry is India already plays a big role, particularly in semiconductor design. In fact, we recently came out with a study by the Boston Consulting Group that found that there's more than 30,000 semiconductor engineers in India, places like Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, that are engaged in chip design. And with, English as a common language, a highly skilled and young workforce, I think there's a huge opportunity there for India to do more. But in the manufacturing space, that's where the government of India is trying to also expand. There's been some potential new announcements. We haven't yet seen kind of ground broken yet or any real progress. And I think it's going to require some hard work by the government of India to also improve the ease of doing business there. For example, a major chip facility at the scale that's required to be productive is going to be a couple of $1 billion. You're going to have millions of chips coming out of that facility. The India market, while it's big, is not enough to sustain the demand. No one single market is enough to sustain demand for most chip makers. And so they're going to be importing and exporting a lot of chips out of those facilities. And right now, things like customs clearance, logistics facilitation aren't quite there yet. And I think, the Indian government knows that it's working hard to make a lot of improvements, and they have made a lot of improvements. The one, I'll just end here, a sign of optimism, and there are many with India, is that downstream, the electronics assembly space, for example, Foxconn, Wistron, Pegatron, setting up major production bases for a lot of their multinational clients. And I think that as that grows, India's attractiveness for particularly semiconductor assembly, test, and packaging, which is the final stage of chip production right before we hand off to the contract EMS manufacturers. I think that's going to see a lot of growth, but there's competition. Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, Mexico are all fighting for a lot of those same investments. So India is going to have to step up and make itself more attractive.
Thank you, Jimmy. So we are coming to the end of this webinar now, and I think we had a lot of takeaways and a lot to learn, maybe a little bit overwhelming for some people. It was to me too, a little bit, to be honest, so much to learn. One thing before we close, I did want to just leave some food for thought before we wrap up, and because we didn't get to discuss much of some other countries in here, and and I would like to raise this, question just to think about, can Japan make a comeback and be a bit more significant than, what it is now? Because at one time, Japan did have all the technology and had resources, maybe not the right strategy, kind of lost out, but it'll be interesting to see if Japan can make a comeback. And I was also going to raise India, but that came out in the question, so I think we're cool there. Again, thank you very much, Lauly and Jimmy. I think that pretty much wraps up our webinar. Thank you for participating, all the guests. And I think that is the end of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.